for there you go, that's official. Welcome everybody. My name is Matt. I'm a curate in Bristol, and I'm involved in a thing called Wild Church. We work closely with the Hazelnut Gang, but in more rural environments. But I'm here now to introduce Jeremy Williams, and he's going to be talking to us about how your church can help build a fairer and greener economy. There's the chat. Please use the chat if you've got any questions. And we can try and leave about 5 minutes at the end, Jeremy, for a bit of a...
Yeah, I'll leave some time for discussion at the end. Yeah.
Brill. Without any further ado, I'll leave you, Jeremy, to introduce yourself further.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, good afternoon. Thanks for being here. Sorry for jumping in really late. It's been a bit of a manic day for me here. I'm just going to close that window because it's a bit noisy. I don't know if you can hear the traffic. Hopefully that's better. Yes, my name is Jeremy Williams, and I work on Green Christians' Joy Enough program, which is a campaign for a greener and fairer economy. I'm also an author, and this book, The Economics of Arrival, is probably the most relevant one to today's topic. My most recent book was actually a children's book, and the one before that was about climate change and race, which I've been talking about a lot recently. I also run an outdoor church in a more urban setting in Luton, and so this whole conference has been just really interesting for looking at some of those themes. So we've only got 25 minutes, so I'm going to keep this quite short and snappy. I'm going to talk for 10 to 15 minutes about some of the challenges as we see them around economics and what we're up to at Joy Enough, and then we'll have hopefully plenty of time to talk about it and get to questions at the end. So first thing that I wanted to say when I was thinking about this was that economics matters to us whether we know it or not. And to begin with, why economics in the first place? What are we talking about when we talk about economics? And in some ways, it's much simpler and more useful than the word can initially appear. The origins of the word are the Greek word oikos, which means household. And so economics originally meant household management. So it was how you ran your family budget, how you balanced your incoming wages and your outgoing expenses, how you planned for the future, and all the everyday decisions that you would make in your household. And really, economics as a discipline is just the big scale version of that. It's about who does what work and how we share the benefits created by that work. And while the language of economics often makes things sound very technical and abstract, it touches on things that we all care about and that touch our lives every day. So, how do I save up for a house? Can I support my children to pay for university? Am I salting away enough for my retirement? Almost certainly not. When times are tight, as a lot of people are experiencing at the moment, how do we reduce our costs and make our money go a bit further? And we've all kinds of questions about why prices are going up as well, and all those sorts of questions come into it. The problem comes in, while we might ask these sorts of questions, we can feel quite powerless about the answers. If I'm not earning enough, then an obvious solution would be to earn more, which is easy to say, but that's not something that I can control in any way. I don't get to set the going rate for freelance writers or the percentage of book sales that come back to me. Neither do I control interest rates or the prices in the supermarket and the sort of inflation of prices that we're seeing at the moment. These things all seem much bigger than me and something that I can worry about that I can't really influence. And that's something that we want to challenge a little bit, because we can influence economics. The economy isn't fixed in stone. It runs a certain way because it's supposed to run a certain way. Decisions have been made about who gets what. And if we weren't involved in those decisions, then somebody made those decisions for us. And that brings me to point number two, the second thing that I wanted to say, which is that economics as currently practiced is failing you and me and global justice. And the future, it's a bit of a mess, quite frankly. We live in a consumer capitalist economy here in Britain, which means that money decides a lot of things. When wealth is created in the economy, who gets what share of it is based on capital. And that means that it's easier to make money from money than it is to make money from work. So to give a practical example of that, during the lockdown in 2020, all the shops closed except the supermarkets, as you'll remember. So the supermarket staff were all asked to come in, wearing masks and putting themselves at risk. And they worked long hours to keep the shelves stocked and to keep everyone fed at a time of unprecedented demand. Now, since they were the only shops that were open, the supermarkets did a roaring trade and the supermarket companies made huge profits. So where did that wealth go? Well, it went to investors. It didn't go to the supermarket workers who put themselves at risk. It went to rich people who didn't do any of the work, but they bought shares in Sainsbury's or Tesco or what have you. Now, I don't think that's fair. I think that's actually a silly way to run an economy, to be quite honest. It means that we're constantly giving more money to the richest rather than making the poor less poor. And to think that doesn't make you a communist. I don't want the government to run everything and centrally plan everything. I don't want to shop in a state-run supermarket and buy one kind of national toilet roll from a national toilet roll factory. What I want is an economy that puts people first, that rewards hard work, and that recognizes that ending poverty might be a higher priority than making the rich richer. Those don't seem like extraordinary things to want from our economics. I also want an economy where nobody gets to dump their pollution on anybody else, whether that's plastic or waste electronics or carbon emissions, and where the natural world is not constantly destroyed for money. Because that's another huge problem with things as they're currently organized. We can't see the trees for the wood. So another practical example, a standing tree is worth precisely nothing to the economy as economics is currently practiced. It has literally no value whatsoever. So you might like the look of it. It might shade you in the summer when there's a heat wave happening. It might make oxygen. You might have pigeons nesting in it. That's all lovely, but none of these things generate economic activity. And so the value of the tree is zero. But if you cut the tree down, well, now you can establish exactly what its value is in timber. So the living world is worthless to an economist and is only valued at the point that it is destroyed. Now that too seems like a strikingly odd and somewhat crazy way to run an economy. And of course, it's leading us into environmental catastrophe. In the pursuit of more money now, we're destroying the living world for others in other parts of the world and for future generations. And of course, we're failing our God-given responsibility to do justice and to love others and to steward resources for those who come after us. So what could we do better? If we had more time, there are all kinds of things that we could talk about, but I'll just run through a handful of things as examples of things that could be done differently. So the first one is that economics should prioritize what matters most. And that is not economic activity for its own sake. So as things currently stand, GDP growth, that's gross domestic product, is the most important metric in economics. And it's widely used as a measure of progress. But GDP doesn't pay any attention to distribution. If all the growth in the economy was just going to one rich person, the GDP figures would still record that as good, even if everybody else was getting poorer every year. And neither does GDP record any losses. So if we sold all of Britain's national parks and turned them into logistics parks for Amazon, that would be recorded as a gain, and nobody would count the loss of the parks. So GDP can easily draw us astray, can lead us astray. And what we want to see at Joy and Enough is broader ways of measuring progress that are based instead on well-being. How do we set up the economy to deliver good lives? And when you ask people what makes a good life, money is only one dimension of that, and it's not the most important. So things like healthy relationships will come up higher, meaningful work is another dimension to that. Good health and free time are all more important than money to most people. So to name a practical policy that might come out of that idea, we might look, for example, at a shorter working week. That would give people much greater flexibility over their time. It would make more time for relationships and for other interests, but it wouldn't grow the economy. It would make a huge difference to our quality of life, but it might mean smaller GDP. So it's something that people will want to fight against, and we have to make the case for it. A second thing that Join Enough campaigns for is an economy that respects natural limits. So the world's richest countries, including Britain, have used far more than their fair share of the natural resources over recent decades and emitted more than their fair share of pollution. And there are all kinds of consequences to that, from air pollution to soil erosion, deforestation, overfishing, and two really big consequences loom especially large. One is the collapse of wildlife numbers, which have dropped by 68% since 1970, according to the Living Planet Index. The world is getting less diverse, less wild, less colorful, and less interesting, quite frankly, with every passing year, because of that loss of wildlife. And as Christians, we should really recognize that as a failure of stewardship. And so what can we do to restore and rewild and heal the land and build back that population of animals, birds, and insects? Another looming crisis, of course, that's very much connected to this one, is the climate crisis. And I don't need to give you the details on that. If you're attending this conference, you're probably familiar with a lot of that already. But what we want to highlight at Join Enough is that there are economic principles behind that climate crisis. The drive for more, for expansion, for profit at any expense. We're not going to avoid a climate catastrophe by asking everyone to do their little bit. Little tips don't add up to preventing climate change. It needs system level change in the way that we provide our energy, how we travel, how we grow our food, how we do business, and how we meet our needs. We need to pioneer new ways of living, and we need to pioneer a new economics for a time of climate breakdown. To give a specific and practical example of that, again, one of the things that we support at Join Enough, and that I'm a little bit involved in here and there, is community energy, which is where, you probably know about this, where local communities sort of club together to put up solar panels or wind turbines, those sorts of things. And what's interesting about this is it has multiple benefits. So you have the environmental side of it, where you're reducing emissions, you're meeting more of your energy needs from renewable sources, but you're also bringing the economic benefits to ordinary communities and households, rather than to distant shareholders. So community energy is better for the environment, but it also creates a more inclusive economy. It reduces inequality, and it gives people a stake in the services that they depend on. And that brings me to another thing that we're working on at Join Enough, and that's a fairer and more inclusive economy. So what do I mean by that? I mean an economy where people have a stake, such as through community energy or through things like employee-owned businesses. It could be through something more wide scale, such as a guaranteed basic income of some kind. But what we're talking about basically is an economy where people aren't left behind, where growth doesn't all go to the richest, where people can afford homes and they can afford to heat them. You know, officially, Britain is the world's 5th richest economy. So you wonder, if we're the 5th richest country in the world, why do we still have food banks? And why are 31% of children growing up in poverty? And this is the crazy thing about that figure, is that 31% hasn't changed in 30 years. Why are things not improving on child poverty? We make tiny bits of progress, a couple of percentage points, and then it goes back up again. And in 30 years, we haven't shifted that at all. So how do we structure an economy so that a greater share of the wealth flows to those who need it most? And example policies here might include things like a living wage or pay differentials to avoid excessive executive pay, which we've all read about in the past. You might look at more taxes on wealth or on land rather than on income and spending, those sorts of things. There are, of course, campaigns for all of these things. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. You know, we've got all kinds of campaigns, including ones run by Christian organizations on the climate, on nature and rewilding, on fair taxation, or on a living wage. So we're not trying to replicate those efforts. What we want to do at Joy in Enough is be a bridge into those conversations for the church. And that brings me on to my last point. What can we do as Christians and churches? In the book of Jeremiah, we see the prophet encouraging his listeners to seek the good of the city. And I think it's a mistake for Christians to think they should stay out of politics and stick to the spiritual stuff, because everything's spiritual. And if we care about justice, justice for the poor, justice for wildlife, justice for those on the front lines of climate change, then we have to roll up our sleeves. So churches shouldn't be afraid of getting involved. We should pray about it. We should pray for those in the congregation that are decision makers, whether that's school governors, councillors, politicians, business people. We should support each other to seek positions of influence, I reckon, in politics and in business and in the community, in healthcare and education, in the media. If we want to see decisions made with compassion and kindness and justice that put the poorest first, then what better way to do that than to be in the room where the decision is made, I reckon. And where I live in Luton, we have quite a nice example of that. There's a local church that really got a vision for this. And they encourage church members to get involved in seeking positions of power. And you know, they started charities, people ran for the council. The guy who planted the church then became the MP for Luton, one of the MPs for Luton, and served 2 terms. So you never quite know how far that might go if you start getting involved. And that sounds like quite a big leap for most churches, I would think. But the most important thing is to talk about it. And as I said at the beginning, people often don't feel equipped to talk about economics, and they don't see how it affects them and the decisions that they make for themselves and for their families. It gets left to the economists, who frankly don't always have our best interests at heart. And that's why we developed the Plenty course at Green Christian, which is a 6-session series of guided conversations. And it covers inequality, debt, consumerism, climate justice, and much more. And it's based in honest conversation and opportunities to learn together. The Plenty course is free to download and use, and it's been running in communities up and down the country in the last few months. And you can find that at www.joyinenough.org. So that's one thing to look out for, joyinenough.org and the Plenty course. And the other thing is I would invite you to put a date in your diaries for our Green Christian Conference, which is Friday the 7th of October in Birmingham. And again, you'll find details there at joyinenough.org. And we'd love to see you there to talk more about how the church can help to create a fairer and greener economy. So that's what I wanted to say. And we've got plenty of time for questions and comments. So how do we manage that? Do people just want to chip in with a question, or Matt, what's your preferred option?
I think we're quite a nice small group. So if people are happy to chip in, if not, if you'd rather not, and you'd rather write a question in the chats, we can do it like that. So yeah, I'm flexible if you are, Jeremy.
Yep, that's fine.
Awesome.
So any questions?
You mentioned the Plenty course. Is that a course for individuals or is that a course for groups?
Sorry, that's a good question. I should have mentioned that. It's a group resource. You could download it and read it for free if you wanted to. But yes, it's designed for small group conversations. And it's free. It's already been paid for. You can make a donation if you like, but it's there for free. And it's all online, so you can just download it and have a look at that.
Jeremy. do you have any examples of, I guess, a lot of the things you were speaking about were quite like macro, quite big, of kind of apart from that really great Luton Church example, which is almost answering my question, but any other examples of kind of local action really causing change in a small, you know, in a town or a city or an environment that can maybe inspire some of us to go and do that in our own churches?
Yeah, well, I think there's always interesting projects in churches that help with the immediate symptoms of a dysfunctional economy. So, for example, there are churches that do debt advice, which is fantastic, and you can really help people out of a hole, not just with their current problem, but giving them skills that will help them to avoid money problems in future. That's a really practical thing. But you also want to get behind that to the injustices that leave people so short of money in the first place, so that you can, you know, avoid those problems for a greater number of people going forward. So we're always trying to look, that's why we keep talking about the macro stuff at the same time. Other things that I've seen churches do, church.co.uk in London. I used to work in an office and they were downstairs, and there was, when austerity was a big thing and budgets were being cut for local councils, the church basically started pulling in all these services that were about to be cut by the council. So they were going to close the library. So they said, well, we've got a great big lobby area at the bottom of the church here, just put the library in our building. And they did. And then they were going to close a nursery building that had a sort of a children's center. And they said, well, we'll take that on and we'll run that in partnership with you so you can keep it open. And they sort of adopted all these different services. Now they're quite an exceptional church. They're connected to Oasis, which has obviously a big infrastructure behind it. But it was that almost having permission to go to the council and say, we can do that for you. I think there's lots of churches that could do that could have council services running out of their buildings if they stop to think about it.
And if they knew what was if they were engaged to know what's going on and where the need is, right? So maybe that's one of the first things to do is to be present at those council.
Exactly. So you'd have to know that the budgets were being cut, that the library was, you know, potentially about to be cut, because most of us would find out that sort of thing when it closed.
Sure.
So you do need to be there. You need to be there in the room to kind of find out about those things. You need to build relationships with people in power, and try and make sure that your church is able to be part of those conversations and play a proactive role. It is a big shift in mindset, but it can be hugely powerful. And if you can imagine being in that community in Lambeth, going to your library and it's in the church, and you see the generosity of the church and the love that they have for the community every time you go to that library. That's a very powerful thing.
Thank you. Thanks so much. That's great. Anyone else? We're kind of going a bit over. We're going to hit time in about 3 minutes, but because it's the last one of the day, I'm sure it's less of a emergency if we run a little bit late. But has anyone got any? Deborah?
Well, it's not a question. I've just put the Green Christian Conference link in the chat, and there's an online component to it as well. So not everybody has to go to Birmingham for it, but it's so it's there.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right. If there's no more questions, I think we might be done for the day. I'm sure lots of you have been engaged all day with the conference, and I hope you got time to chill out now. I need to go and chair a PCC meeting in an hour, so
right.
But I do. If we could all show our appreciation, Jeremy, thank you so much. Bless you. See you at one of these amazing other things going on around the country. I'm encouraged that there's so many people engaged around the country, and it's it's been my pleasure to spend some time with all of you, and go well, take care.
Thanks, Matt. Bye-bye.